World War II didn't just produce legendary weapons. It also gave rise to countless bizarre ideas. Under intense time pressure, desperation, and the belief that maybe this will work, many inventions were rushed forward before anyone had time to think them through. In this video, we're taking a look back at 40 of the stupidest and most unsuccessful inventions of World War II. Soviet Union. Anti-tank dogs were trained to carry explosives and run underneath enemy tanks. In practice, many dogs panicked, ran back towards Soviet positions, or crawled under Soviet tanks instead, making the concept dangerous for all sides involved. A 40 flying tank was an attempt to turn a light tank into a glider by attaching massive wooden wings. The towing aircraft lacked sufficient power, and the project was abandoned after a single test flight. Rocket-propelled infantry weapons proved too heavy, inaccurate, and unreliable. Although intended to increase infantry firepower, they were poorly suited to real combat conditions. Poorly sealed amphibious tanks frequently flooded during river crossings, rendering them completely ineffective. Human-guided explosive devices were tested for sabotage missions but were quickly abandoned due to extreme risk and very limited effectiveness. Oversized rocket artillery platforms promised devastating firepower, but their lack of accuracy and high cost made widespread deployment impractical. United States. Project Pigeon was an experimental U.S. program that used trained pigeons to guide bombs. The birds were placed inside the nose of the weapon, where they viewed the target through an optical system and pecked at the image of enemy ships, mechanically adjusting the control surfaces. Although early tests showed promising results, the project was canceled after being judged too unconventional and impractical for combat use. Bat bombs were designed to release thousands of bats carrying incendiary devices over Japanese cities. During testing, the bats accidentally ignited fires at U.S. military bases, leading to the project's cancellation. Project Habakkuk was a proposal to build massive floating aircraft carriers made from reinforced ice. Despite successful small-scale prototypes, the concept proved far too impractical to implement. Explosive rats were intended to sabotage German boilers by detonating when discovered. The devices were intercepted before they could be used operationally. Early acoustic homing torpedoes were easily distracted by noise and often locked onto friendly targets instead of the enemy. Disposable aircraft concepts were explored for special missions but abandoned due to high costs and limited effectiveness. Large personal flamethrowers were developed to increase infantry firepower, but in practice they posed a serious danger to their operators. Exposed fuel tanks, excessive weight, and limited mobility meant that even minor damage could turn the soldier into a lethal target. Remote-controlled bomb vehicles frequently suffered from signal loss and unreliable performance under battlefield conditions. Nazi Germany. Landkreuz P-1000 Rada was a proposed 1,000-ton super heavy tank that existed only on paper. In reality, it would have been impossible to move, supply, or deploy on any battlefield. Landkreuz P-1500 Monster pushed the concept even further by attempting to mount naval artillery on a land vehicle, making it completely impractical for combat use. Panzer VIII Maus was nearly invulnerable to enemy fire, but its extreme weight prevented it from crossing bridges or maneuvering effectively. Neubaufahrzeug, a multi-turret tank design, was already obsolete by the time it appeared, offering little real combat value. The V-3 Supergun never became operational, as its launch sites were destroyed by Allied air attacks before it could be deployed. Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor, caused more pilot fatalities during landing accidents than from enemy action. A Bakamba 349 Natter was an experimental German interceptor launched vertically by rocket to counter Allied bomber formations. The pilot controlled the aircraft only briefly before the weapon section was released, while the airframe and pilot were intended to descend by parachute. In practice, the system was extremely dangerous and unreliable, making the mission effectively close to a one-way flight. Mistel composite aircraft used a piloted aircraft to guide a large explosive charge, but achieved only very limited operational success. Early infrared night vision systems were bulky, short-ranged, and impractical for widespread battlefield use. The Sun Gun existed only as a science fiction concept, based on the idea of focusing solar energy from orbit to destroy targets on the ground. During World War II, materials science, optics, and rocket technology were far from sufficient to make such a weapon feasible, leaving it confined to theoretical studies. Japan, Oka, was a manned rocket bomb developed by Japan, designed to strike enemy ships at extremely high speed. The pilot could only control the weapon during the final approach, with no landing gear or escape system, because it had to be released close to the target by a carrier aircraft and was nearly impossible to turn back. Oka missions were effectively one-way flights, leaving the pilot with almost no chance of survival. Kaiton were manned torpedoes that required their operators to guide themselves directly into enemy ships, making survival virtually impossible. Shinyo explosive boats were small, lightly built suicide craft that were easily destroyed and achieved very limited results. Fukuryu divers waited underwater with mines attached to long poles, intending to detonate them against enemy vessels, a mission that was effectively suicidal. Fugo balloon bombs drifted across the Pacific toward the United States but had negligible military impact. Submarine aircraft carriers were highly complex and technologically ambitious, but delivered little strategic value in practice. Wooden aircraft designs suffered from serious durability and performance issues, limiting their effectiveness. Bamboo spear training reflected Japan's severe manpower shortages in the final stages of the war, as increasingly desperate measures were adopted. United Kingdom, Pansandrum was a massive rolling bomb that frequently lost control and veered off course. Sticky bomb, an adhesive anti-tank weapon, sometimes stuck to the person throwing it instead of the target. Early human torpedoes were extremely dangerous and unreliable, posing serious risks to their operators. Unstable mine-clearing vehicles often endangered their own crews due to poor stability and mechanical limitations. Smith gun was an improvised anti-tank weapon mounted on a wheeled frame that was unstable, difficult to aim, and dangerous for its crew to operate. Northover projector was a crude spigot mortar designed to fire incendiary grenades. It had extremely short range and was hazardous to the operator. Blacker bombard was a spigot mortar intended for home defense. Its limited range and low accuracy made it ineffective against armored targets. Cultivator number 6, Nelly, was a massive trench-digging machine intended to cut through enemy defenses. It was slow, noisy, and obsolete by the time it was completed. Trench-digging tanks were experimental armored vehicles designed to dig trenches while advancing, but proved impractical under combat conditions. Italy and Axis allies. L-3 tank was protected by armor so thin that, in many cases, calling it a tank was generous. When faced with enemy fire, it was often knocked out of combat almost immediately. Radio-controlled boats proved far too complex to operate reliably under wartime conditions. Improvised anti-tank guns lacked both sufficient firepower and adequate protection, limiting their effectiveness on the battlefield. Experimental multi-role vehicles were designed with the ambition of replacing several types of military equipment in a single platform. In practice, this made them overly complex to operate, too weak for combat, and too cumbersome to be truly mobile, attempting to solve every problem, but ultimately solving none. Other notable failures. Emergency improvised armored vehicles of Romania were temporary armored platforms built from trucks or civilian chassis. Thin armor, overworked engines, and poor stability quickly exposed their limitations when facing real military firepower. Temporary infantry anti-tank weapons used by Romania included Molotov cocktails, hand-placed mines, and simple improvised explosive devices. These weapons forced soldiers to approach tanks at extremely close range, and while they could be effective in certain situations, they posed severe risk to the user. Early remote-controlled bombs, tested by Hungary, were explosive devices or bomb vehicles guided by radio control. Signal limitations, latency, and battlefield interference made them difficult to control and rarely effective in practice. Early experimental anti-tank guns, developed by Hungary, suffered from problems with penetration, accuracy, and operator safety, leaving gun crews exposed to significant risk without delivering a clear battlefield advantage.